Your Honor, my daughter is mentally unstable and financially incompetent. My father said those words without a stutter. He wanted my bank account. He wanted my apartment. He even wanted the Honda Civic. I drove to the courthouse he thought he had won. Then the bailiff opened a sealed steel briefcase, stamped with a Department of Defense logo. He pulled out item number 3. The judge's face went pale. He looked at my father, then at me, and slammed his gavel so hard it cracked. Bailiff, lock the doors. Nobody leaves this room. My parents froze. They thought they were taking guardianship of a broke freelancer. They did not know they were trying to steal from a federal asset. My name is Nia, and 3 months ago I walked into a lion's den armed only with a store-bought watch and a secret that would burn my family to the ground. Before I tell you how I sent my own brother-in-law to prison, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the black sheep who was actually the wolf. It started on a humid Saturday in Atlanta. My father Calvin was turning 60, and the driveway of my parents' estate was lined with Mercedes and Range Rovers. I pulled up in my 10-year-old gray sedan, the brakes squeaking just loud enough to turn heads. I saw him immediately. Gavin, my brother-in-law. He stood by the valet stand wearing a suit that cost more than my car, a glass of scotch in his hand. He did not wave, he checked his watch. Nia, he said loud enough for the guests to hear. I thought you would park down the street. We are trying to maintain an aesthetic here. I stepped out, smoothing my simple navy dress. Happy birthday to Dad. Gavin, good to see you too. He laughed, a dry, hollow sound. Did you finally get that promotion at the... What is it? The data entry center? Or are we still pretending that is a real career? I pay my bills, Gavin, I said, keeping my voice even. Barely. He sneered, blocking my path to the front door. Look at this car. It is an embarrassment. Brenda is inside. Is wearing vintage Chanel. You look like you are here to cater the event. I pushed past him, my stomach tightening. I was not hurt. I was annoyed. Inside the house smelled of expensive lilies and old money. I made a beeline for the kitchen, hoping to slip my gift onto the pile unnoticed. Nia, my mother, Joyce, did not hug me. She grabbed my arm and pulled me into the pantry. What are you wearing? She hissed. Her eyes scanned me like a barcode reader, rejecting a coupon. I told you, this was a black tie affair. You look like a librarian. It is clean and it fits Mom, I said. I am here to celebrate Dad. You are here to embarrass us, she corrected. Stay in the back near the kitchen service entrance. Do not mingle with the investors. Gavin is trying to close a deal tonight, and I will not have you explaining your little computer typing job to the CEO of Apex Realty. I swallowed the urge to scream. If only she knew that the CEO of Apex Realty had emailed me 2 days ago begging for a security audit. I stayed silent. Hour later the speeches began. My sister Brenda. The golden child glided to the center of the room. She was glowing, holding a microphone like she was born with it. Daddy, she cooed. Gavin and I wanted to give you something special. Pack your bags because you and Mom are going to Tuscany for 2 weeks. First class. The room erupted in applause. My father wiped a tear. I knew for a fact. Gavin was drowning in debt, and my parents had likely paid for their own trip. But the performance was flawless. Then it was my turn. The room went quiet. I handed my father a small, neatly wrapped box. Happy birthday, Dad, I said. He opened it. It was a vintage compass restored from his time in the Navy. It was not flashy. It was meaningful. He looked at it, then looked at me with a mix of pity and disgust. Thank you. Nia, he said, his voice flat. It is very quaint. He placed it on the table without a second glance. Wait, my father said, reaching into his jacket pocket. I actually have something for you, Nia, since the whole family is here. My heart stopped. Was this an apology? A check? He pulled out a thick yellow manila envelope. He did not hand it to me. He tossed it onto the cake table. It slid across the white tablecloth and stopped right in front of me. "Open it," Gavin said from behind me. My hands trembled as I undid the clasp. I pulled out the legal documents. The bold letters at the top made the room spin. Petition for conservatorship. Reason incapacity. Due to mental instability. "What is this?" I whispered. "It is for your own good," my mother said, stepping forward. Her face a mask of fake concern. "We petitioned the court this morning. We are taking control of your finances and your living situation. You obviously cannot handle life on your own. Nia, look at you, you are 32 and you have nothing." "You are suing me?" I asked, looking at my father. "On your birthday we are saving you," my father said coldly. "Gavin has kindly offered to manage your assets. The court hearing is on Tuesday." The room was dead silent. The guests stared at me like I was a broken toy. Gavin leaned in close to my ear, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and rot. "Don't worry, Nia," he whispered so only I could hear. "We will sell that little apartment of yours. The family needs the cash more than you do. We will spend it for you." I looked at him. I looked at my parents. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just closed the folder. "See you in court," I said. They thought I was walking away in defeat. They did not know I was walking away to initiate Protocol Ghost. The heavy oak door slammed shut, echoing through the foyer like a prison gate, sealing my fate. The party was over. The guests had driven away in their luxury cars, leaving me alone in the living room with the 4 people who were supposed to love me, but were currently plotting my demise. My mother. Joyce kicked off her heels and sank into the white leather sofa, letting out a long sigh as if destroying my life was exhausting manual labor. My father Calvin poured himself a glass of brandy, his hands steady, his eyes avoiding mine. I did not sit down. I stood in the center of the Persian rug, clutching my purse, my knuckles turning white. I needed them to underestimate me, but I also needed to see exactly how far they were willing to go. "This is ridiculous," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. "Look at this. I have a credit score of 750. I have 0 debt. I have paid my mortgage on time for 5 years straight. You cannot just declare me incompetent because you feel like it. A judge will laugh at you." My sister Brenda laughed first. It was a sharp, cruel sound. She was leaning against the fireplace, swirling a glass of champagne, looking every bit the golden child she had always been. "Oh, Nia, you are so naive," she said, walking over to her purse. She pulled out a thick file folder and tossed it onto the coffee table. It landed with a heavy thud, making the crystal glasses rattle. "We knew you would try to fight this," Brenda said, smiling sweetly, "so we came prepared. Open it." I reached for the folder, my fingers brushing against the cold manila paper. Inside were documents that looked terrifyingly official. There were medical records from a doctor I had seen once in college for mild exam anxiety, but the notes had been completely altered. Instead of mild stress, the diagnosis now read severe bipolar disorder with paranoid delusions and history of psychotic breaks. I stared at the paper in horror. "This is fake," I said, looking up at her. "I never took these medications. You forged Dr. Evans' signature." Brenda shrugged, taking a sip of her drink. "It is not forgery, if the doctor agrees to testify. Isn't it amazing what a generous donation to a private practice can achieve? And it is not just the doctor, Nia. We have statements from your neighbors, too. Mrs. Gable in 4B. She signed an affidavit stating she hears you screaming at the walls at 3 in the morning and that you leave trash in the hallway. Mrs. Gable, I whispered. She is legally blind, and I buy her groceries every Tuesday. Why would she do this? Because I paid her rent for the next year." Gavin spoke up from the corner of the room. My brother-in-law was leaning against the wet bar looking bored. He swirled the ice in his glass and looked at me with cold, dead eyes. "Everyone has a price, Nia," he said, walking toward me. You are the only one who does not understand how the economy works. You think hard work and following the rules matters. It does not. Leverage matters. And right now, we have all the leverage. Why are you doing this? I asked, turning to face him specifically. Why my apartment? It is a one-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood. It is not worth enough to ruin your reputation. Over Gavin chuckled, shaking his head as if explaining quantum physics to a toddler. That is where you are wrong. He walked over to the window, looking out at the sprawling lawn. It is not about the apartment unit, Nia. It is about the land. The city just approved the rezoning for the downtown corridor. Your building sits on the corner of 5th and Main, specifically the corner where I plan to build the entrance to the new luxury shopping complex. I have acquired every other unit in that building except yours. You are the holdout. The stubborn little stain on my blueprints. I felt a chill run down my spine. This was not about protecting me. This was not even about family drama. This was a business transaction. I was just a line item to be deleted. So you are going to declare me insane, take guardianship and then sell my home to yourself for pennies on the dollar. Smart girl. Gavin raised his glass in a mock toast. Finally, you are catching up. I turned to my father, hoping, praying for a shred of humanity. Dad, you cannot let him do this. You know how hard I worked for that place. I saved every dollar. You know, I am not crazy. Tell them to stop. My father finally looked at me. He took a long swallow of his brandy and set the glass down heavily on the marble coaster. He looked tired, but not apologetic. He looked at me with the same disappointment he had shown since the day I decided not to marry a doctor. Nia, listen to me. His voice was deep and final. You are being emotional, which just proves our point. You are not smart enough to hold on to an asset like that property. You do not have the vision. He gestured toward Gavin, who was smirking. Let Gavin handle it. Nia, let him take the reins. He is a white businessman, for God's sake. He knows how to operate in this world better than you ever will. He can turn that dusty apartment into millions for this family. You should be thanking him for managing your future, because clearly you are incapable of doing it yourself. The room fell silent. The air felt thick with the weight of his betrayal. It was not just greed. It was a fundamental lack of respect. He truly believed that, because Gavin was a white man in a suit, he was inherently superior to his own black daughter, regardless of her achievements. I looked at my mother, expecting her to defend me. She just checked her nails and said, "Listen to your father, Nia. He knows best." Something inside me snapped, but on the outside I went completely still. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical focus. I was no longer their daughter. I was Agent Nia Vance, and they had just confessed to conspiracy and fraud while I was wearing a wire. I lowered my head, forcing a tremble into my voice, playing the part of the defeated victim one last time. Okay, I whispered, letting my shoulders slump. If that is what you think is best, Dad, good. Gavin clapped his hands together, rubbing them greedily. We will have the papers ready for the judge on Tuesday. Do not try to leave town. Nia. We froze your accounts an hour ago. You have nowhere to go. I nodded, wiping a fake tear from my cheek. I guess I will go to my room. Then I said softly. I walked out of the living room, hearing the clinking of glasses and laughter erupt behind me. They were celebrating their victory. They were toasting to my destruction. But as I climbed the stairs to the dusty guest room they had forced me into, I did not feel fear. I felt the weight of the recorder taped to my chest warm against my skin. I closed the door to the bedroom and pulled out my burner phone, sending a single text message to my handler at the bureau. They took the bait. Initiate Phase 2. My father was right about one thing. Gavin did know how the business world worked, but I knew how the federal prison system worked, and I was about to give them all a front row seat. The next morning, the sun was shining brightly over Atlanta, but my world was rapidly turning dark. I tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, driving my battered Honda Civic to the local coffee shop I visited every day. I ordered a black coffee and a bagel. Needing the caffeine to fuel the war, I was silently fighting inside my head. When I tapped my debit card against the reader, the machine beeped a harsh dissonant sound that made the customers behind me shuffle impatiently. "I am sorry," Nia the barista said, her voice dropping to a sympathetic whisper. "It says declined. Try it again," I said, forcing a smile, knowing exactly what was happening. My hands felt cold as I tapped the card a second time. Declined. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. The screen flashed red. Account frozen, court order. Pending conservatorship investigation. Gavin did not wait for the hearing on Tuesday. He had called in a favor with a corrupt judge and filed an emergency ex parte order claiming I was an immediate danger to my own financial assets. He had cut off my lifeline before I even had a chance to hire a lawyer. I left the coffee shop empty-handed, my stomach growling. The humiliation burned my cheeks, but I swallowed it down, telling myself it was just part of the cover. I drove back to my apartment, the modest one-bedroom rental I used to maintain my cover as a struggling freelancer. As I turned onto my street, my heart hammered against my ribs. My landlord, Mr. Henderson, was standing on the sidewalk, and next to him were 3 cardboard boxes. My boxes. "Mr. Henderson, what is going on?" I asked, parking the car and running up to him. He was a kind man in his 70s, usually full of smiles, but today, he looked terrified. He could barely meet my eyes. "I am so sorry, Nia," he said, his hands shaking. "A man came here this morning. A man in a very expensive suit. He showed me papers. He said you are mentally unstable and that if I let you stay here, I would be liable for any damages you cause. He also said he knows about the unpermitted wiring in the basement, and he would call the city inspector if I did not have you out by noon." Gavin. He had not just frozen my money, he had threatened an old man to make me homeless. He wanted to strip me of everything, my shelter, my dignity, my independence, so that I would have no choice but to crawl back to them. "I am sorry, Mr. Henderson," I said softly, touching his arm. "I do not want you to get in trouble. I will go." I packed the rest of my things into my trunk, which did not take long. I stood on the curb looking at the building that had been my sanctuary. It was not much, but it was mine. Now I was effectively homeless, with $0 to my name, and a family that viewed me as a liability to be liquidated. I drove 2 blocks away and pulled into the back lot of an abandoned shopping center, checking my mirrors to make sure I was not being followed. I reached under the driver's seat and pulled out a small burner phone. Taping it to the underside of the dashboard was my failsafe. I dialed a number that did not exist in any public directory. The line clicked once, then a voice answered, clear and distorted. "Agent Vance, report." "They took the bait," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "The target, Gavin Miller, has successfully leveraged a corrupt judicial contact to freeze my assets and displace me from my residence. I am currently compromised in the public sector." "We can pull you out." "Naya," the voice said, "listen to me. We have enough to indict him on the real estate fraud alone. You do not need to go back in there. It is too dangerous." "No," I said, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. "The real estate fraud is just the surface. Gavin is laundering money for the cartel through my father's accounts, and I suspect they manipulated my grandmother's will to fund it. I need physical access to the ledger inside the house. If you pull me out now, they will lawyer up and shred the evidence. I need to be inside." "Permission granted," the voice said. "Initiate ghost protocol. We are monitoring your vitals. If your heart rate spikes above 140 for more than a minute, we are sending in the tactical team." I hung up and destroyed the SIM card, tossing the pieces into a sewer grate. Ghost protocol meant I was on my own. No backup, no badge, just me acting the part of the broken daughter. I drove to my parents' estate, the iron gates looming like the jaws of a beast. Giving up felt like dying, but I knew it was the only way to get close enough to kill the beast from the inside. When I pulled up the driveway, my mother was waiting on the porch, arms crossed, looking triumphant. Gavin stood next to her, looking like a cat that had just eaten the canary. "Look at you," Joyce said, shaking her head as I dragged my suitcase up the stairs. "We told you you could not make it on your own, homeless in less than 24 hours. It is pathetic. Nia, truly pathetic." "I am sorry, Mom," I whispered, lowering my head, pretending to be broken. I did not know where else to go. "We are doing this because we love you," Gavin said, stepping forward. He reached out his hand. "Give me your car keys. Nia, you are in no state to drive, and frankly, seeing that junk heap in the driveway devalues the property." I hesitated, just for a second, then dropped the keys into his palm. He closed his fingers around them, a smirk playing on his lips. "Welcome home, Nia," he said. I walked past them into the house, into the trap, knowing that tonight I would be sleeping under the same roof as the people who stole my life. But they did not realize they had just invited the investigator right into the crime scene. The room they gave me was not a bedroom. It was a storage closet tucked beneath the main staircase, barely large enough to fit a twin mattress on the floor. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and mothballs, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled luxury of the rest of the house. I stood in the doorway, clutching my suitcase, and looked up at my mother, expecting her to feel at least a flicker of shame. But Joyce just smoothed her silk blouse and pointed inside. "It is cozy," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "And it is better for you down here." "Nia," the doctor said, "you need a low-stimulus environment. No windows to distract you. No views to trigger your episodes." I looked up the stairs toward the second floor, toward the room that had been mine for 18 years, toward the sanctuary where I had studied for my degrees, and dreamed of a life bigger than this. "Can I at least go upstairs to get a book from my old shelf?" I asked, knowing the answer before she gave it. "That is not your room anymore," my mother said, turning away. "Gavin needed a home gym. He needs space to decompress after working so hard to fix your mess." I walked up the stairs later, when no one was looking, and peeked through the crack in the door. My childhood sanctuary was gone. The walls were painted a sterile gray, lined with mirrors and heavy weights. The bed where I used to dream was replaced by a treadmill. The only thing that remained of me was the ghost of a girl who used to live there. Now even my past had been evicted to make room for Gavin's ego. That evening, the humiliation continued in the kitchen. My mother stood by the granite island, tapping her fingers impatiently as I unpacked my bag. "Electronics," she demanded, holding out her hand. "Laptop, phone, smartwatch. Hand them over." I knew this was coming. The court order Gavin had filed included a clause about restricting my access to communication to prevent me from harassing financial institutions or spreading delusions. I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop. My mother snatched it with a greedy gleam in her eyes. She thought she was holding the key to my banking passwords and my contacts. She did not know that 20 minutes before I arrived, I had swapped the internal hard drive for a decoy, loaded with nothing but generic cat photos and corrupted text files. The real drive containing the evidence of their laundering was taped to the inside of a vent in the basement. She tossed my smartphone into a drawer and handed me a heavy gray device that looked like it belonged in the 90s. "Here is your phone," she said. "It calls me, it calls your father, and it calls emergency services. That is it. No internet, no apps, no distractions. Focus on getting better." "Nia." I took the brick phone and nodded, playing the part of the obedient child. "Thank you, Mom," I whispered. But obedience was just a costume. At 2 in the morning, when the house was finally silent, slipped out of the storage closet. I did not need light. I had memorized the layout of this house decades ago. I moved across the marble floors in my socks, silent as a ghost, avoiding the creaky floorboard near the dining room entrance. My target was the study. The room where my father and Gavin spent hours locking the door and speaking in hushed tones. I eased the heavy door open and slipped inside. The room smelled of cigars and secrets. I moved quickly to the massive mahogany desk, pulling a tiny device no larger than a button from the hem of my shirt. It was a high-frequency listening device standard issue for field operations. I stuck it to the underside of the desk near the back, where no one would ever feel it. Just as I turned to leave, I heard footsteps, heavy and uneven, coming down the hall. I dove behind the heavy velvet curtains, acting on instinct, just seconds before the door swung open. The lights flickered on. It was Gavin. He was wearing a silk robe and holding a tumbler of whiskey, did not look at the files on the desk. Instead, he pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number, putting it on speaker as he paced the room. "Pick up, baby," he slurred slightly. A woman's voice filled the room. Sultry and annoyed Gavin. "It is late. Are you with your wife?" "Brenda is asleep." Gavin laughed, dropping into the leather chair right in front of my hiding spot. "She took a sleeping pill. She is out cold. Listen, I just wanted to tell you to go pick out the color." "The color?" the woman asked, her tone shifting to excitement. "For the Range Rover," Gavin said, grinning. "I told you I would make it happen. The judge is signing off on the conservatorship next week. As soon as I get the power of attorney, I am liquidating the sister's apartment. The land is worth a fortune, but the unit itself is a quick cash grab." "You are really going to sell her home?" the woman asked, giggling. "She does not need it," Gavin sneered, taking a sip of his drink. "She is going to be living in state care by the time I'm done with commission from the land deal and the cash from her accounts. I can buy you the car and put a down payment on that condo in Miami we talked about." I held my breath, my heart pounding against my ribs, not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline of victory. He had just confessed to premeditated fraud and intent to misuse funds while I was in the room. "I love it when you take charge," the woman purred. "I do what I want," Gavin said, arrogance dripping from every word. "This family thinks they are using me to save their reputation, but I am the one running the show. Now go to sleep, baby. Your new car is coming." He hung up, finished his drink, and walked out, leaving the lights on. I waited 10 minutes before I moved, slipping out from behind the curtain. I looked at the desk where the bug was planted and smiled. They took my laptop and gave me a closet. But they forgot that walls have ears, and I was done listening. I was recording. For the next 7 days, I ceased to be a daughter and became a maid in the house where I was raised. The humiliating routine was designed to break my spirit, to enforce the narrative that I was incapable of functioning in society without their benevolent guidance. My sister Brenda took particular pleasure in this new dynamic. She treated me not like a sibling, but like a rebellious servant who needed to be taught a lesson in humility. On Wednesday morning, Brenda cornered me in the laundry room. She dumped a wicker basket filled with delicate silk garments onto the floor right in front of me. "Hand wash," only she commanded, pointing a manicured finger at the pile. "And be careful with the red blouse. It costs more than your entire wardrobe. If you ruin it, I will have Mom deduct it from your allowance." I looked at the pile of dirty clothes, then up at my younger sister. She was wearing a tennis outfit, white and pristine, even though she had never played a set in her life. "I am not your maid, Brenda," I said, keeping my voice low and trembling just enough to sound pathetic. Brenda laughed, a harsh sound that bounced off the tiled walls. "You are living here, rent-free, eating our food and using our electricity. You need to earn your keep. Naya, honestly, you should be grateful. Finally, you have a purpose that matches your skill set. Now get to scrubbing." I spent the next 2 hours submerged in soapy water, my hands turning red and raw, while Brenda sat in the kitchen eating a grapefruit and watching reality television. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted copper, reminding myself that every insult was being catalogued. Every act of degradation was fuel for the fire I was about to rain down on them. But the laundry was nothing compared to what Gavin had in store. Saturday afternoon was scorching hot, the Georgia sun beating down on the asphalt driveway. Gavin summoned me outside, where his obsidian black luxury sedan was parked covered in a thin layer of pollen. He stood on the shaded porch sipping a glass of iced tea, watching me with the eyes of a slave driver. "Make it shine, Nia," he called out. "The partners are coming over for poker tonight, and I want them to see their reflection in the hood." I filled a plastic bucket with soapy water and grabbed a sponge. My back ached from sleeping on the thin mattress in the storage closet, but I bent down and started scrubbing the rims of his tires. Sweat trickled down my spine, making my dress cling uncomfortably to my skin. Gavin walked down the steps, inspecting my work like a drill sergeant. "You missed a spot," he said, pointing to the fender with the toe of his Italian leather loafer. I moved to wipe it, but before I could reach the car, Gavin pulled his leg back and kicked the bucket of soapy water. It tipped over, splashing cold gray sludge all over the front of my dress and soaking my shoes. I gasped, jumping back, shock radiating through me. "Oops," Gavin said, his voice dripping with false apology. He did not look sorry. He looked delighted. He took a step closer to me, invading my personal space until I could smell the expensive cologne, masking the scent of his cruelty. "Look at you," he sneered, gesturing at my soaked clothes. "You are a mess, Nia. But honestly, this look suits you on your knees, cleaning up after your betters." He leaned in close, his whisper like venom in my ear. "See this. This is your true position in life, serving the elite. You were never meant to sit at the table, Nia. You were born to clear it. Now refill the bucket and finish the job." I watched him walk back inside, chuckling to himself. I did not cry. I did not scream. I simply picked up the bucket and walked to the hose spigot. My hands were steady. My resolve was iron. They thought they were breaking me, but they were simply polishing a diamond under pressure. That night, as the house slept, I retreated to my closet and put on my headphones, connecting to the live audio feed from the bug in the study. My parents were in there, and for the first time, they did not sound arrogant. They sounded terrified. The audio crackled, and I heard my father's voice shaking. "We are out of time, Joyce." The guys from Vegas called again. They said if I do not have the first installment by Friday, they are going to send someone to the house. My mother's voice was sharp, panic edging into her tone. "Tell them we have the assets. Tell them the conservatorship is a done deal." I tried, Calvin. I heard the sound of glass shattering as if my father had thrown a tumbler against the wall. "They do not care about court dates. They want cash. They said they would break my legs if I stall again. We need Nia's money now. We need to liquidate her portfolio. The second the judge bangs that gavel." I sat in the dark, staring at the glowing screen of my burner phone. It all made sense now. The rush, the brutality, the desperation. It was not just greed, it was survival. My father had gambled away their fortune, and now he was trying to feed me to the sharks to save his own skin. I recorded the clip and uploaded it to the secure server, labeling it Exhibit D, Desperation. They were not just bad parents, they cornered rats. And on Tuesday I was going to close the trap. On Thursday morning my privacy was violated yet again. I was sitting on my thin mattress, reviewing the mental map of my father's financial records, when the door to my closet was yanked open. My mother stood there looming over me like a shadow, filling the small space with the scent of aggressive perfume and desperation. She did not ask permission. She simply stepped inside and began rifling through my open suitcase, her hands clawing at my meager possessions with zero regard for boundaries. "I need cash. Nia," she snapped, tossing my folded shirts onto the dusty floor. "Your father is dealing with a liquidity issue because of the freeze on the accounts, and we need to pay the caterer for the brunch tomorrow. You must have something of value in here." I watched her silently, my pulse steady. She was desperate. The loan sharks were closing in, and she was reduced to looting her own daughter's luggage, looking for scraps to keep up appearances. Her fingers stopped on a small velvet pouch tucked into the side pocket. She pulled it out and dumped the contents into her palm. It was a single strand of pearls, the clasp tarnished and dull, the beads slightly irregular in shape. My mother snorted, holding it up to the dim light. "This is what you keep, a string of fake pearls. It looks like something you bought at a flea market for $5. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from correcting her. Those were not fake. They were natural saltwater pearls. From the 1920s, left to me by my grandmother. Specifically because she knew my mother would never appreciate their subtle beauty. Unlike the flashy costume jewelry my mother adored, these pearls were worth $50,000 easily. But to the untrained eye of a woman who only valued things that sparkled, they looked like junk. "Go down to the pawn shop on 4th Street, Joyce commanded, shoving the necklace into my chest. "Get whatever you can for it. We need at least $50 for the appetizer tray. If you cannot get 50, do not bother coming back." I took the necklace and nodded, playing the role of the obedient servant. I walked 3 miles to the downtown district, the heat radiating off the pavement, soaking through my cheap dress. When I pushed open the door to Gold City Pawn, the bell chimed, and the smell of stale cigarette smoke hit me. The man behind the counter looked up. He was a large man with a scar running down his cheek, named Elias. To the world, he was a fence for stolen goods. To me, he was a confidential informant. "I had flipped 3 years ago during a RICO investigation, Nia," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "You look like hell, boss. What are you doing here?" I slid the pearls across the glass counter along with a scrap of paper. "Keep these in the safe. Elias Protocol. 7. Do not sell them. Do not display them. Just hold them until I come back for them." Elias looked at the pearls, then at me, his eyes narrowing. He knew. Protocol 7 meant deep cover. He knew it meant my life was on the line. "Understood," he murmured, sweeping the pearls into a drawer beneath the counter. "What do you need?" "I need a receipt for $40 and $40 in cash. Small bills. Make them look dirty." He opened the register and pulled out a wad of crumpled singles and fives, handing them to me with a fake pawn ticket stamped with the word "scrap." "Watch your back out there, Nia," he said quietly. "The word on the street is that Gavin is looking for a buyer for a commercial lot downtown. People are saying he is desperate." "I know," I said, pocketing the cash. "I will see you on the other side." "Elias." I walked all the way back to the estate, clutching the dirty money, my feet blistered and sore. When I walked into the kitchen, my mother was pacing, holding a glass of wine that was far too full for 2 in the afternoon. "Well," she demanded, extending her hand. "Did you get it?" I pulled out the crumpled bills and placed them on the marble island. $40, Mom. That was all. "He would give me—" "He said they were just glass beads." My mother stared at the small pile of money, her face twisting in disgust. She swiped her hand across the counter, sending the bills fluttering to the floor like dead leaves. $40, she screamed, her voice shrill and breaking. "You are useless, Naya, utterly useless. I ask you to do one thing, one simple thing to help this family. And you bring me $40. That won't even cover the shrimp cocktail." I stood still, looking down at the money scattered near her expensive heels. She was standing there in a $1,000 blouse, screaming over $40 because she was too ignorant to recognize a $50,000 treasure when she held it in her hand. "Pick it up," she hissed, pointing at the floor. "Pick it up and get out of my sight. You make me sick." I slowly bent down, gathering the bills one by one. I did not feel humiliated anymore. I felt a strange sense of calm clarity. I looked up at her from the floor, watching her pour another glass of wine, shaking with rage and fear. She thought she was throwing away trash, but as I pocketed the money and turned to leave, I realized she had just thrown away her last chance. She had held her salvation in her hand and sold it for scraps solely because she was too arrogant to look past the surface. And on Tuesday, when the judge opened the evidence file, she would finally learn the true cost of her ignorance. On Friday morning, the heavy oak door swung open to reveal a man who looked more like a used car salesman than a medical professional. He was short, with slicked back hair and a suit that was slightly too tight across the shoulders. Gavin introduced him as Dr. Eris, a renowned specialist who was doing the family a favor by conducting a home visit. Usually I would have laughed at the absurdity of a house call in the 21st century. But there was nothing funny about the glint in the doctor's eyes, nor the heavy leather bag he carried, which looked less like a medical kit and more like a mobile cage. We sat in the formal living room, the air conditioner humming a low artificial buzz. My mother sat in the corner pretending to read a magazine, but I could see her eyes darting over the top of the pages watching us like a hawk. Dr. Aris did not waste time with pleasantries or standard diagnostic questions. He did not ask about my sleep patterns or my diet. He pulled out a silver pen and a notepad that was already halfway filled with writing. "So, Nia," he began, his voice oily and patronizing, "your brother-in-law tells me you have been exhibiting erratic behavior, specifically regarding financial delusions and aggressive outbursts toward family members. Tell me, do you often feel the urge to hurt yourself when things do not go your way?" I stared at him, keeping my hands folded in my lap to hide the fact that I was subtly adjusting the clip of the ballpoint pen attached to my collar. It was not a normal pen. It was a military-grade recording device capable of capturing audio through layers of fabric. "I do not have aggressive outbursts," I said, calm and measured. "I am upset because my assets have been frozen without cause. I am a forensic auditor, Dr. Eris. I am fully capable of understanding what is happening here." Dr. Eris sighed, shaking his head as if I had just confirmed his worst fears. He scribbled something furiously on his pad, ignoring my actual words entirely. "Paranoid delusions regarding profession and persecution," he muttered loud enough for me to hear. He looked up, his expression hardening. "Nia, listen to me. I can sign a temporary hold right now. I can have an ambulance here in 10 minutes to take you to a state facility where they will sedate you for 72 hours just to get a baseline. Or you can cooperate. You can admit that you are overwhelmed and that you need your family to take the reins. If you sign this voluntary admission of incapacity, we can keep this private. No sirens, no straitjackets. Just you getting the rest you need here at home." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He was giving me a choice between a prison cell and a cage made of lies. If I refused, he would drug me and drag me out kicking and screaming, which would only prove his diagnosis. If I agreed, I would be signing away my freedom and my property to Gavin. I looked at my mother, expecting her to intervene, to say that threatening to institutionalize her daughter was going too far, but she just turned a page of her magazine, her indifference cutting deeper than any knife. I knew what I had to do. I had to give them the show they wanted. I let my lower lip tremble. I allowed my breathing to become shallow and ragged, creating the physical symptoms of a panic attack. "Please," I whispered, letting my voice crack. "Do not send me away. I am scared. I do not want to go to the hospital." Dr. Ayres smiled, a predator, sensing weakness. He leaned forward, invading my personal space. "Then admit it. Nia, admit you cannot handle this life anymore. Admit you want to die." It was a monstrous thing to say, a line designed to break a fragile mind. But my mind was a fortress. I squeezed my eyes shut, squeezing out real tears born of frustration. "I cannot do it," I sobbed, rocking back and forth slightly. "I just want it to stop. Please do not take me away." "Perfect," Dr. Ayres said, sitting back. He did not offer a tissue. He did not offer comfort. He simply capped his pen and closed his notepad, as if he had just closed a business deal. He stood up and walked over to where my mother was sitting, tapping her on the shoulder. "She is broken." Joyce barely held it together for 5 minutes. "The court will have no choice but to grant the petition." Then he pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number. He did not step out of the room. He did not lower his voice. He stood right there in front of the sobbing, broken woman he thought he had destroyed, and called his boss. Hey Gavin, it is Iris, the doctor said, his voice booming in the quiet room. It is done. She is completely unstable, manic-depressive with suicidal ideation. I have her begging not to be committed. He paused, listening to Gavin on the other end, and then laughed a cruel sound that made my blood run cold. How bad do you want the report to be? I can write it up as temporary stress, or I can paint a picture that ensures she never controls a bank account again for the rest of her life. Schizophrenia, bipolar 1. You name it, and I will sign it. I sat there, my face buried in my hands, shaking with what looked like fear, but was actually the vibration of the recording pen, capturing every single word of his confession. He was asking for a menu of diagnoses, like he was ordering a sandwich, and Gavin was paying for the lunch. Make it the full package, Gavin must have said, because Aris grinned. Consider it done. I will have the papers notarized by Monday. You will have the power of attorney by Tuesday morning. Enjoy the new land deal, my friend. He hung up and looked at me one last time with a look of utter contempt. Get some rest, Nia, he said. You are going to need it. As he walked out the front door with my mother trailing behind him, thanking him for his help, I stopped crying instantly. I wiped my face and looked at the pen clipped to my shirt. They thought they had just signed my death warrant, but they had just handed me the murder weapon. The basement of my parents' house was a graveyard of forgotten things, a damp concrete tomb filled with the debris of their materialistic lives. On Saturday afternoon, my mother sent me down there with a vague command to reorganize the holiday decorations. She claimed she wanted to be ready for the upcoming season, but I knew it was just another way to keep me out of sight, to keep me busy with menial labor, while Gavin and his lawyers finalized the paperwork that would strip me of my rights. The air was thick and heavy, tasting of dust and neglect. I moved stacks of plastic bins labeled Christmas and Easter, my hands covered in grime as I lifted a heavy box filled with vintage ornaments the cardboard bottom gave way, spilling glass balls and tinsel all over the concrete floor. I cursed under my breath, kneeling to clean up the mess, and that was when I saw it. Tucked inside a crushed box of tangled lights was a leather-bound journal. I recognized instantly. It was my grandmother Theodore's diary. My breath hitched in my throat. I picked it up, running my fingers over the worn cover, memories flooding back so fast they made me dizzy. Suddenly, I was not in the basement anymore. I was back in the sterile white hospital room 3 years ago, standing by my grandmother's bedside the day before she died. I remembered the desperate look in her eyes. She had lost the ability to speak clearly, her voice reduced to a rasping whisper. She had grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong, her nails digging into my skin. Nia, she had wheezed, her eyes wide with panic. The paper. Nia, check the safe, do not let them. Before she could finish, my mother Joyce had stepped in, pulling my grandmother's hand away from me with a force that was almost violent. She is delirious. Nia, my mother had said, her voice sharp and dismissive. She does not know what she is saying. Step back. You are agitating her. I had stepped back. I had obeyed. And the next day my grandmother was gone. 2 weeks later, Gavin produced a will that left everything to my parents, leaving me with nothing but a few trinkets. I had believed it then. I had believed that my grandmother simply forgot me. I opened the diary, my hands trembling. The pages were brittle, yellowed with age. I flipped to the entries from the last month of her life, reading her elegant cursive script. September 12th, the entry read, Calvin came by again asking for money. He says it is for a business investment, but I smell the whiskey on him. I told him no. He got angry. He shouted things a son should never say to his mother. I am scared he will steal from me again. My heart pounded against my ribs. I turned the page. September 20th. I do not trust the new man, Gavin. He looks at my house like my house. He is measuring it for a coffin. He brings me papers to sign, but I pretend I cannot find my glasses. I know what they are doing. They think I am senile, but I am just tired. I flipped to the final entry, written just 3 days before she died. The handwriting was shaky, but the message was clear. October 2nd. I called my lawyer, Mr. Henderson, today. I signed the new will. I am leaving the estate, the house and the trust fund entirely to Nia. She is the only one with a good heart, the only one who will not gamble it away. My son and his wife are vultures. I have hidden the copy of the will in the safety deposit box at First National. Only Nia has the key. I dropped the diary onto the cold concrete floor as if it burned me. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. There was no oversight. There was no mistake. Gavin had not just forged a few signatures, he had orchestrated a complete theft of my inheritance. The will they probated was a fake. The money they used to fund their lavish lifestyle to buy. Gavin's cars and my mother's furs belonged to me. Tears welled up in my eyes, but they were not tears of grief. I was done grieving. I wiped my face, leaving a streak of gray dust on my cheek, and felt a cold, hard knot form in the center of my chest. For years I had felt guilty for not being the daughter they wanted. I had felt inadequate, poor and small. But I was never poor. I was the heiress to a fortune they had stolen and squandered. I looked at the diary lying amidst the broken ornaments. This was not just a memory, it was evidence. It proved motive. It proved a pattern of financial abuse that predated my current situation by years. I picked up the book and tucked it into the waistband of my skirt, hiding it under my loose shirt. I did not feel fear anymore. I did not feel the need to defend myself. The goal had shifted. Survival was no longer enough. I stood up in the dark basement, surrounded by the ghosts of their greed, and made a silent vow to my grandmother. They silenced you on your deathbed, I whispered into the darkness. But they are going to hear you loud and clear when I play this in court. I went back upstairs, my face composed, my eyes dry. I was going to finish cleaning their basement. I was going to wash their dishes and scrub their floors. I would let them think they had won for exactly 3 more days. Because when Tuesday came, I wasn't just coming for my freedom, I was coming for everything they had stolen, and I was going to make sure they paid with interest. Sunday night provided the window of opportunity I had been waiting for. Gavin was out, allegedly meeting with investors, but the GPS tracker I had slipped into his coat pocket earlier that day placed him squarely at the Diamond Flush Casino. My mother had taken a sleeping pill and retired early, leaving the house in a silence that felt heavy and expectant. I moved through the shadows of the hallway, my bare feet making no sound on the cold marble floor. My destination was the master's study, specifically the wall safe hidden behind the portrait of my great-grandfather, a man who would have been ashamed to see what his lineage had become. I locked the study door behind me and approached the painting, lifting it down with careful precision. The safe was a vintage model, a Sargent and Greenleaf dial that my father was inordinately proud of. He thought it was impenetrable, but he did not know that cracking safes was part of my field training. During my 2nd year at the Bureau, I did not need a stethoscope or a drill. I just needed my fingertips and the patience of a hunter. I rested my forehead against the cold steel, closing my eyes to block out the visual noise, focusing entirely on the tactile feedback of the tumblers falling into place. Left 4 turns to 32. Right, 3 turns to 10. Left, 2 turns to 55. I felt the final gate align, a subtle vibration that traveled up my arm. I turned the handle, and the heavy door swung open. With a soft metallic sigh, I pulled out my burner phone and began to work. My hands moved with practiced efficiency, flipping through pages and snapping high-resolution photographs of every document inside. The contents were worse than I had imagined. It was not just debt. It was a complete financial autopsy of a dying man. My father had borrowed over $200,000 from unlisted lenders at predatory interest rates. But the real smoking gun was in the blue folder at the bottom. It contained bank transfer records, showing monthly payments from my father's company, accounts directly into a shell corporation owned by Gavin. It was embezzlement. My father was stealing from his own partners to pay off Gavin, who was likely blackmailing him, while simultaneously drowning him in more debt. I was photographing the last page when a beam of light swept across the sheer curtains, startling me. The sound of a car engine purring up the driveway followed immediately. My heart slammed against my ribs. It was only 10 o'clock. Dad was not supposed to be home from his club until midnight. I shoved the papers back into the safe and spun the dial, locking it just as the front door downstairs opened and the alarm chime echoed through the house. There was no time to get back to my room. Under the stairs, heavy footsteps were already thumping up the staircase. I looked around frantically. The desk was too open. The curtains were too sheer. My eyes landed on the narrow coat closet in the corner, where my father kept his winter trench coats. I dove inside, pulling the door shut just as the study door handle turned, leaving only a sliver of darkness between me and discovery. I held my breath, pressing my hand over my mouth. The closet smelled of cedar and stale cigar smoke. My father walked in, his gait uneven. He did not turn on the main light, relying on the lamp by the desk. I heard the clink of glass against glass, the sound of liquid being poured nervously. Then the sound of a phone dialing on speaker. Pick up, damn it," my father muttered, his voice thick with fear. The line connected, and Gavin's voice filled the room, loud and arrogant over the speakerphone. "Calvin, I am in the middle of a winning streak. This better be important." My father collapsed into his leather chair, the springs groaning under his weight. "Gavin, I cannot do it. I cannot testify against her on Tuesday, looking her in the eye while we steal everything she worked for. It is too much. She is my daughter." There was a pause, and then Gavin laughed, a cold, cruel sound that made my skin crawl. "Oh, now you have a conscience. That is rich, coming from the man who embezzled $500,000 from the chaotic pension fund. Do you want me to send those ledgers to your partners? Calvin, or maybe to the FBI? You are not in charge here. You are a puppet, and I hold the strings. But the girl is innocent." My father pleaded, a sob catching in his throat. "Innocent does not pay your gambling debts," Gavin snapped. "Stick to the script. Calvin, we get guardianship, we sell the land, and I wipe your slate clean. Deviate, and you die in prison. Do I make myself clear?" The line went dead. My father let out a long, agonizing groan and threw his glass against the wall, shattering it. He sat there for another 10 minutes, weeping softly, the sound of a broken man who had sold his soul and realized too late that the price was too high. Finally, he stood up and stumbled out of the room, likely heading to the guest room to drink himself into oblivion. I waited until I heard his door close before I dared to move. My legs were cramping and my adrenaline was crashing, leaving me shaking. I pushed the closet door open and stepped out, moving quickly toward the exit. I needed to get back to my crawl space. I needed to upload these photos. But in my haste, I did not notice the shard of glass from my father's broken tumbler lying near the rug. My foot caught it, sliding across the hardwood floor. The glass did not cut me, but the heel of my shoe dragged across the pristine mahogany, leaving a deep, visible white scratch right in the center of the room. I froze, looking down at the mark. It was unmistakable. In a house where appearances were everything, a scratch like that would be noticed. It was a footprint of my presence, a physical piece of evidence that someone had been in the room who wasn't supposed to be. I could not fix it, and I could not stay. I slipped out of the room and down the back stairs, praying that my father would be too hungover to look at the floor in the morning, because if they realized I had been in there, the psychological warfare would end and the physical danger would begin. Monday night felt less like a family gathering and more like a coronation ceremony. Gavin had invited his business partners and a few select friends to the estate to toast to his upcoming real estate victory. The air in the house was thick with the smell of expensive cigars and the clinking of crystal glasses. My mother had ordered catered hors d'oeuvres, and I was relegated to the kitchen tasked with slicing limes and refilling ice buckets, like a hired servant, while they celebrated the theft of my life. In the next room, I stood at the granite island slicing a lemon with a sharp paring knife, my movements rhythmic and precise. Through the crack in the swinging door, I could hear them laughing. My father sounded louder than usual, his voice booming with the false bravado of a man who had drunk enough to forget he was selling his daughter to pay his debts. My mother was giggling, sounding girlish and relieved, believing that by tomorrow all their financial sins would be washed away by my liquidation. The door swung open and Gavin stumbled in. He was holding an empty tumbler, and his tie was loosened around his neck, revealing the flush of alcohol on his skin. He was not just tipsy, he was drunk with power and scotch. He stopped when he saw me leaning against the doorframe with a lopsided grin that made my stomach turn. "Well, if it isn't the guest of honor," he slurred, walking toward me heavily. I did not look up from the lemon. I was slicing. "I am just getting more ice." "Gavin?" I said quietly. He moved faster than I expected, crossing the kitchen and slamming his hand down on the counter, right next to my hand, stopping the knife. "Look at me when I am talking to you," he commanded, his breath hot and smelling of oak and decay. I slowly set the knife down and raised my eyes to meet his. His pupils were dilated, swimming in a pool of arrogance. "You think you are so smart, don't you, Nia?" he sneered, leaning in close enough that I could see the pores on his nose. "You always have." "I do not know what you mean," I said, keeping my face neutral. "Don't play dumb," he spat, spraying a little saliva. He reached out and grabbed my chin, forcing me to look at him. "You have always looked at me like that. Like I am some kind of joke. Like you are analyzing me." He let go of my face and paced a small circle around me, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That is why I hate you, Nia. It is not just the money, although the money is going to be sweet. It is that look in your eyes. You sit there in your cheap clothes, driving your cheap car, acting like you are better than us, like you see right through the suit and the car and the deals. You think you are above this family." He laughed, a dark, bitter sound. "But tomorrow I am going to break you. I am going to take that little apartment you love so much, and I am going to sell it to my shell company for pennies. Then I am going to take the proceeds and buy a boat, and you—" he poked me hard in the shoulder with a stiff finger. "I am going to throw you in a state facility where they will medicate that superior look right off your face. And do you know the best part? Your parents are going to sign the papers with a smile. They are going to thank me for taking the burden off their hands." I stood there listening to his confession, knowing that the recording device taped to my chest was capturing every vile syllable. He was admitting that this had nothing to do with my mental health. It was vindictive. It was about power. It was about a mediocre man trying to crush a woman who intimidated him simply by existing. He grabbed the bottle of scotch from the counter and poured himself another drink, filling the glass to the brim. "So, say goodbye to your freedom, Nia," he said, raising the glass. "Tomorrow you belong to me." I looked at him standing there in his expensive suit that was paid for with stolen money. I looked at the sweat beading on his forehead and the slight tremble in his hand. The fear I had felt days ago was completely gone, replaced by a cold, clinical detachment. I saw him not as a monster, but as a target, perfectly acquired. I picked up a slice of lemon and dropped it into his drink, the acid splashing slightly over the rim. "You should enjoy that scotch, Gavin," I said, my voice low and steady. "Savor every drop." He paused the glass halfway to his lips, frowning, confused by my tone. "What is that supposed to mean?" I offered him a small, thin smile, the first genuine expression I had shown him all week. "It means you should enjoy the finer things while you can, because this might be the last truly good drink you have for a very long time." Gavin stared at me for a second, trying to process the threat through the haze of alcohol. Then he burst out laughing, shaking his head. "You really are crazy," he said, taking a massive gulp. "I cannot wait to hear the judge read your file." He turned and stumbled back toward the party, leaving me alone in the silent kitchen. I wiped the counter down one last time. I was not crazy, I was prepared. And as I listened to his laughter fade down the hallway, I knew that tomorrow, the only thing Gavin would be drinking was the bitter taste of his own destruction. Tuesday morning arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum, heavy with rain that refused to fall, implying a storm that was waiting for the perfect moment to break. Just like me, I had asked permission to go to the library to print resume copies. A lie. My mother swallowed because it fit her narrative of my pathetic struggle for employment. Instead, I walked 2 blocks to a greasy spoon diner on the edge of town where the coffee tasted like burnt rubber and the booths were taped together with duct tape. Sitting in the back corner was a man in a rumpled suit that looked 2 sizes too big, wearing thick glasses that slid down his nose. To the world he was, Mr. Cole, a court-appointed public defender who had barely passed the bar exam. To me, he was Special Agent Cole, a senior analyst with the Bureau, and the only person who knew that today was not a hearing, but a sting operation. I slid into the booth opposite him, and he did not look up from his lukewarm eggs immediately. He pushed a manila folder across the sticky table toward me. It looked like a standard case file, but inside were the finalized indictments, stamped and ready for the federal prosecutor's signature. "Are you sure about this?" Nia Cole asked, his voice low, hardly moving his lips. "We have enough on the wiretaps to arrest Gavin. For money laundering right now. We can skip the court circus. We can pull you out." I shook my head, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "No. If we arrest him now, he gets a plea deal. He gets 5 years in a minimum security facility for financial fraud. I want him to stand in front of a judge and lie. I want him to present forged medical records and perjured testimony. I want my parents to swear under oath that I am incompetent. Because once they do that, it is no longer just fraud. It is conspiracy to defraud the court. It is perjury. It is a federal hate crime against a protected witness. I want them to bury themselves so deep that not even the best lawyers in Atlanta can dig them out." Cole looked at me for a long moment, then nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "You are cold, Vance," he said admiringly. "They think they are walking into a victory lap. They are walking into a meat grinder," I corrected. "I will see you in the courtroom, Cole. Do not be late." I left the diner and walked back to the estate, the humidity making my hair frizz, adding to the unkempt look my family insisted I maintain. When I entered the house, the energy was chaotic. My mother was running around barking orders at the housekeeper while Gavin was on the phone in the study rehearsing his victim statement. Joyce intercepted me at the bottom of the stairs, holding a pile of fabric that smelled of mildew and mothballs. "Go change," she commanded, shoving the bundle into my arms. "The car leaves in 20 minutes, and I will not have you looking presentable." I unfolded the clothes. It was an oversized gray sweater that had belonged to my grandmother, but had been ruined in the wash, and a pair of sweatpants that were stained and frayed at the hems. "Mom," I said, trying to keep the edge out of my voice, "I have a suit I can wear. I want to show the judge I am capable of caring for myself." "That is exactly what we do not want." She snapped her eyes wide and manic. "We need the judge to see that you are falling apart, Nia. We need him to see a woman who cannot function, who needs her family to step in and save her. If you walk in there looking put together, you ruin the narrative. Now put on the clothes, or I will tell the judge you were violent this morning." I looked at her, really looked at her. She was wearing a Chanel suit worth $5,000. Her hair perfectly coiffed, her makeup flawless. She was dressing for a gala while dressing her daughter for a funeral. "Fine," I said quietly, turning toward the closet under the stairs. "I will wear it." I retreated into the dark, cramped space and stripped off my clean clothes, pulling on the scratchy oversized sweater. It hung off my frame, swallowing me whole, making me look small and fragile. The sweatpants were loose, dragging on the floor, forcing me to shuffle when I walked. I looked down at my hands, ensuring my nails were unpolished and jagged, just as she wanted. There was a small, cracked mirror leaning against the wall of the closet. Propped up behind a stack of old shoes, I crouched down and looked at my reflection. The woman staring back at me looked broken. She looked like a shadow of a person, a tragic case of potential wasted, terrified, and alone. My hair was messy, my clothes were rags, and my posture was slumped. But then I looked closer at the eyes. The face was a mask of defeat, but the eyes were burning with a cold, hard fire. They were the eyes of a predator waiting in the tall grass, watching the prey graze unknowingly. My mother wanted a victim. She wanted a prop to garnish her sympathy vote. She wanted a broken doll she could place on a shelf and control forever. I stood up, straightening my spine just for a second before slumping back into character. "You want a victim, Mom?" I whispered to the empty room. "I will give you the best performance of my life. But when the curtain falls, you are going to realize that you did not dress me for my execution. You dressed me for yours." I opened the door and shuffled out into the hallway. Head down, shoulders hunched, ready to play the part of the fool one last time, knowing that the smartest person in the room is usually the one everyone else is laughing at. The courtroom was not just a place of law, it was a stage, and Gavin was the director. He had tipped off the local press, painting this as a heartbreaking story of a prominent family stepping in to save their troubled daughter. Reporters sat in the back row, notebooks open, hungry for the scandal. I sat at the defendant's table, looking small and pathetic in my ruined sweater, my hair frizzy and unkempt, just as my mother had demanded. To the world I looked like a woman unraveling, but under the table my hand was wrapped tight around the silver pen that contained their digital coffins. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed, and Judge Sterling walked in. He was an older man with a reputation for being tough on family disputes. He looked at me, then at my parents, who were sitting behind the plaintiff's table, looking like a portrait of grief and dignity. My mother dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, while my father stared at the floor, looking suitably burdened. Gavin sat between them, his chest puffed out, ready to play the hero. Peter, the family lawyer, stood up first. He was a man who loved the sound of his own voice, and he began his opening statement with theatrical flair. "Your Honor, we are here today with heavy hearts." He began, gesturing to my parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller are pillars of this community. They have tried everything to help their daughter Nia, but her mental decline has become dangerous. She is unable to maintain employment. She lives in squalor, and her financial decisions are erratic to the point of self-destruction. We are asking the court to grant full conservatorship to her brother-in-law, Gavin Miller, solely to protect her from herself." I sat stone still, letting his words wash over me. He called me a burden, a parasite, a danger to society. I saw the reporters scribbling furiously, eating up the narrative. The flash of a camera went off, capturing my downcast eyes. Likely destined for the front page of the local paper under the headline, "Local Heiress Loses Mind." Then came the parade of liars. Dr. Aris took the stand first. Looking respectable in his suit, he placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the whole truth. Then proceeded to lie with the ease of a sociopath. "I conducted a home evaluation on the defendant," he told the judge, looking directly at me with mock sympathy. "She exhibited classic signs of paranoid schizophrenia. She was delusional, claiming she was a government agent and that her family was stealing from her. She was aggressive and unstable. In my professional opinion, she requires immediate institutionalization and 24-hour financial supervision." I felt a flash of heat up my neck. Dr. Aris had never heard me claim to be an agent. He had invented that detail to make my actual job sound like a hallucination. It was a smart move. If I stood up now and said I worked for the FBI, everyone would think it was just another symptom of my sickness. Cole, my lawyer, placed a hand on my arm, signaling me to wait. Next was Mrs. Gable, my neighbor from the apartment complex. She walked up to the stand wearing a new coat that looked suspiciously expensive. She avoided looking at me entirely, staring fixedly at the judge. Nia was a nightmare tenant, she said, her voice shaking slightly. She would scream at all hours of the night, banging on the walls. She left rotting food in the hallway. I was terrified of her. Frankly, I am glad her family is finally doing something about it. It was a masterful performance engineered by Gavin's wallet. Mrs. Gable, who I had driven to church for 3 years, was selling me out for rent money. I watched Gavin smirk at the press table. He looked confident, untouchable. He thought he had bought every person in the room. Peter rested his case, looking smug. The judge turned to us, his expression stern. "Does the defense have any witnesses?" he asked, clearly expecting us to fold. Cole stood up, buttoning his rumpled suit jacket. "No witnesses, Your Honor," he said, his voice calm, causing a ripple of confusion in the room. "But we do have a rebuttal regarding the plaintiff's claim that the defendant has no significant assets to manage. We believe the motivation for this conservatorship is not medical but predatory." Gavin laughed out loud, a short, sharp bark of amusement. My mother shook her head, looking at the press as if to say, "See, she is delusional." Judge Sterling looked over his glasses. "Predatory. Explain yourself, counselor." Cole turned to me and nodded. It was time I reached into my bag, not for a tissue to wipe away tears, but for the list that would end them all. The silence in the room was heavy, like the air before a lightning strike, and I was about to bring the thunder. My mother Joyce walked to the witness stand like a martyr ascending the scaffold. She clutched a lace handkerchief in her manicured hand, dabbing at eyes that were perfectly dry until the moment she sat down. Then on cue the tears began to flow. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award, a masterclass in manipulation that turned the entire courtroom into an audience of sympathizers watching a tragedy unfold. Peter, the family lawyer, approached her with a softness reserved for grieving widows. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice dropping to a respectful whisper, "I know this is difficult for you, but please tell the court why you are seeking this conservatorship. Why is it necessary to take legal control over your daughter's life?" My mother took a shaky breath and looked out at the gallery, avoiding my gaze entirely. She looked fragile. She looked exhausted. She looked like a woman who had given everything and received nothing but pain in return. "I love my daughter," she began, her voice trembling, "just the right amount. I have always loved her. But raising Nia has been a struggle since the day she was born. She was never like the other children. She was always distant, angry, and prone to violent mood swings. We tried therapy, we tried medication, we tried everything money could buy, but nothing worked. I sat at the defense table listening to her rewrite history. She was inventing a childhood that never happened. She spoke of tantrums I never threw, of fires I never started, of money I never stole. She was weaving a tapestry of lies so dense and detailed that even I found myself wondering if perhaps I was the crazy one. But then I felt the weight of the recording pen in my pocket, and the cold, hard reality of the facts anchored me. Peter pressed on gently, guiding her toward the kill shot. "And how has her recent behavior affected the family?" "Mrs. Miller," my mother let out a sob that sounded like it was ripped from her soul. She looked directly at the judge, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "It has destroyed us. Your Honor, we live in constant fear. We do not know if she is going to hurt herself or hurt us. She squanders money on delusions while we work ourselves to the bone trying to clean up her messes. She calls us names. She threatens us. Gavin has been a saint trying to help her, but she just spits in his face." She paused, wiping her nose with a handkerchief, and then she delivered the line that was designed to end me, the line that was supposed to seal my fate and justify their theft. "I have spent 32 years trying to save her," she whispered, leaning into the microphone so her voice echoed through the silent room. "But I am tired. I am so tired. Sometimes I look at her and I feel nothing but fear and exhaustion. God forgive me for saying this, but I regret it. I regret ever giving birth to her. She is not a daughter. She is a burden. A heavy, suffocating burden that is dragging this entire family down into the grave with her. Please, Your Honor, please let us manage her. Let us control this so we can finally have some peace. The courtroom erupted in hushed whispers. I could hear the reporters muttering to each other, scribbling down the quote. Mother regrets birth. Daughter, a burden. The sympathy in the room shifted entirely to the sobbing woman on the stand and the stoic father sitting behind her, looking grim. They saw a tragedy. I saw a crime. I did not look down in shame as she expected. I did not cry. I did not hide my face in my hands. I slowly lifted my head and looked directly at my mother. I channeled every ounce of my training, every interrogation I had ever conducted, every suspect I had ever broken, and I focused it all into a single piercing stare. I looked at her, not as a daughter looks at a mother, but as a predator looks at prey. I let her see the intelligence she claimed I lacked. I let her see the cold calculation behind my eyes. I let her see that I knew everything. Joyce happened to glance in my direction, expecting to see a broken child. Instead, she met my gaze, and for a split second, her mask slipped. She faltered. The sobbing stopped abruptly, and a flash of genuine terror crossed her face. She saw the wolf behind the sheep's clothing, and she realized with a jolt of primal fear that she just poked a beast she did not understand. She quickly looked away, staring down at her lap, her hands trembling for real this time. The judge cleared his throat, clearly moved by her testimony. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller," he said gently. "You may step down." My mother hurriedly left the stand, avoiding me completely as she rushed back to the safety of Gavin's side. Gavin put a protective arm around her, smirking at me over her shoulder. He thought the war was won. He thought they had successfully painted me as a monster, and themselves as the saviors. He listened to the murmurs of the crowd, the pity for the poor parents, the disdain for the ungrateful daughter, and he basked in it. But as I watched my mother sit down, shaking not from grief, but from the sudden chilling realization that I was not afraid, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. They had played their ace. They had used their strongest weapon, the bond of family, to destroy me, and I was still standing. I leaned over to Cole, my lawyer, and whispered, "Are you ready for the turn?" Cole adjusted his glasses, looking at the spectacle of my weeping mother and the smug Gavin. "Let us burn it down," he whispered back. I sat back and waited, knowing that in less than 5 minutes, the tears my mother was shedding would turn into something far more bitter, because the only thing worse than a burden is a burden that fights back with the full weight of the federal government. Peter walked back to the plaintiff table and picked up a single thin sheet of paper, holding it between his thumb and forefinger, as if it were something dirty. He approached the bench with a sigh that was meant to convey the immense burden his clients were undertaking. He placed the paper in front of Judge Sterling, smoothing it out with a dismissive hand. "Your Honor, seeing as the defendant is clearly incapable of managing her own affairs, we have taken the liberty of compiling a complete inventory of her assets." Peter said, his voice dripping with false modesty. "We are prepared to take full fiduciary responsibility for her estate immediately upon your ruling." The judge looked down at the paper, adjusting his glasses. "Read the inventory into the record, Counselor," Judge Sterling said, leaning back in his leather chair. Peter cleared his throat and turned slightly so the reporters in the back could hear him. He wanted to make sure everyone knew just how little I was worth. "Item 1. Peter read loudly. One personal checking account with a current balance of $2,140. Item 2. One 2015 Honda Civic with significant structural damage and over 150,000 miles, valued at approximately $3,000. Item 3. Personal effects, including used clothing and costume jewelry, estimated value under $500, and finally the lease to a rental unit on 5th Street, which the family intends to terminate to prevent further debt. He lowered the paper and looked at me with a pitying smile. That is the sum total of Nia Vance's life, Your Honor. A net worth of less than $6,000 and no property. My clients are willing to take on the burden of her living expenses because they are generous, loving parents. We ask that you sign the order, transferring control of these meager assets to Gavin Miller, effective immediately, so we can get this poor woman the help she needs. Gavin leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs, looking like a king who had just conquered a village of mud huts. He winked at me, a gesture so arrogant it made my skin crawl. He mouthed the word, goodbye, knowing that once that gavel came down, I would lose the right to buy a stick of gum without his permission. The judge picked up his pen, ready to sign the document that would end my freedom. Mr. Cole, do you have any objections to the inventory list? The judge asked, looking at my lawyer. Cole did not stand up. Instead, he looked at me and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. It was the signal I stood up. My chair scraped against the floor, the sound loud and harsh in the quiet room. I object, Your Honor, I said, my voice clear and projecting to the back of the room. Peter rolled his eyes and turned to the judge. Your Honor, please, the defendant is speaking out of turn. This is exactly the kind of disruptive behavior we are trying to manage. Judge Sterling lowered his pen, looking at me with curiosity. Ms. Vance, you are represented by counsel. You should let him speak for you. I am not speaking as a defendant. Your Honor, I said, stepping away from the table and walking into the center of the aisle. I am speaking as the asset. If the court is going to grant guardianship to my brother-in-law, then the court must ensure he understands the scope of his liability under federal law. I turned to look at Gavin, who was frowning slightly, his smile fading just a fraction. If you take guardianship, Gavin, you are legally responsible for every single asset attached to my Social Security number. Not just the ones you know about, not just the ones you want to sell. You have to manage everything. Do you accept that responsibility? Gavin chuckled, shaking his head, leaning forward toward the microphone. Of course I do. Nia, he said, his voice thick with condescension. I will take care of your little car and your checking account. Do not worry, I am good with numbers. I turned back to the judge. My brother-in-law has accepted liability, but the inventory list submitted by his lawyer is incomplete. It is missing 99% of my portfolio. Peter laughed a loud barking sound. Your Honor, she is doing it again. She is hallucinating wealth she does not have. This is a waste of the court's time. I ignored him, keeping my eyes locked on the judge. I request that the court reads the certified asset schedule provided by the Department of Justice, which was submitted to the bailiff this morning under seal. I want the full list read into the record, so Mr. Miller knows exactly what he is stealing. The room went silent. The judge looked at the bailiff, standing by the side door. The bailiff, a large man who had been standing guard over a metal briefcase, nodded solemnly. Your Honor, I do have a sealed inventory list verified by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, he said. Judge Sterling's eyebrows shot up. He looked at Peter, who looked confused, and then at Gavin, who looked annoyed. Open it, the judge commanded. Read the amended list. Gavin leaned over to my mother, whispering loud enough for me to hear. Let them read it. It is probably a list of her imaginary friends or a collection of seashells. She thinks she has a treasure chest. She is completely gone. My mother giggled nervously, patting Gavin's hand. Poor thing, she whispered. She really believes her own lies. I stood there, my hands clasped behind my back, watching them laugh at the edge of the cliff. They thought I was manic. They thought I was pathetic. They had no idea that the bailiff wasn't just holding a list. He was holding the hammer that was about to shatter their glass house. Read it, Judge Sterling ordered, leaning forward, his interest piqued. The bailiff set the metal case on the table and undid the latches with a loud, heavy click. He pulled out a thick document stamped with a red government seal. Gavin smirked, shaking his head. Look at the drama. She probably printed that off the internet. The bailiff cleared his throat and began to speak, and the smirk vanished from Gavin's face forever. The bailiff placed his heavy hands on the latches of the steel briefcase, and the sound of the locks disengaging echoed through the silent courtroom like a pair of gunshots, click, click. The air in the room instantly grew heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. Gavin was still leaning back in his chair, a smirk plastered on his face, but I saw his eyes dart toward the metal case with a flicker of unease. He expected a few bank statements, maybe a hidden savings account with a few $1,000s. He did not expect federal clearance levels. The bailiff opened the lid and the interior was lined with black foam protecting a stack of thick cream-colored documents. He did not rush. He adjusted his glasses and pulled out the first file, holding it up to the light. The paper was heavy and stamped with a gold seal that shimmered under the fluorescent lights. Item number 1. The bailiff announced, his voice booming from the diaphragm, commanding the attention of every soul in the room. He cleared his throat and read from the top line. 100% equity ownership in Blackwall Cybersecurity Solutions, a private defense contracting firm, currently holding active Level 5 security clearance. The silence in the room was broken by a collective gasp that sounded like all the oxygen being sucked out at once. The reporters in the back row stopped scribbling and looked up, mouths agape. My mother let out a small, confused squeak. The bailiff continued, ignoring the reaction. Current valuation of asset based on last fiscal year government contracts is $50 million. $50 million. The number hung in the air, vibrating against the wood paneling. Gavin shot out of his chair as if he had been electrocuted. His face was a mask of disbelief and rage. "Objection," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "This is a lie. This is a fabrication. She typed this up in her basement. She fixes laptops for cash. She does not own a defense contractor." Judge Sterling slammed his gavel down with a force that made the water pitcher rattle. "Sit down, Mr. Miller." "But, Your Honor," Gavin sputtered, his arrogance rapidly dissolving into panic. "It is impossible. Look at her. Look at how she is dressed." The judge narrowed his eyes, peering over his spectacles at the document the bailiff had placed on his bench. "Mr. Miller, this document bears the seal of the United States Treasury and the signature of the Secretary of Defense. Unless you are accusing the federal government of perjury, I suggest you sit down and shut your mouth." Gavin collapsed back into his chair. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw the dawn of realization. He was trying to reconcile the sister-in-law he bullied with the woman who owned a company worth more than his entire bloodline. The bailiff reached back into the case. He pulled out the second document. This one was a deed. A property deed. Item number 2, the bailiff read. Full ownership of the commercial high-rise property located at 500 Wall Avenue, including all ground-floor retail spaces and the penthouse executive suites. The color drained from Gavin's face so fast he looked like a corpse. 500 Wall Avenue. He knew that address. He knew it intimately. It was the address of his own real estate firm. It was the building where he went to work every day. The building where he played the big shot CEO. The building where he had threatened to crush me just last week. I watched Pétir, the family lawyer. The man who had been so smug just minutes ago looked down at the table. His hand went slack and his expensive fountain pen rolled off the wood, clattering loudly onto the floor. He did not bend down to pick it up. He stared at the list, then he turned his head slowly to look at Gavin. "You rent your office?" Pétir whispered, his voice carrying in the stunned silence. Gavin did not answer. He was staring at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He was realizing that for the past 5 years, every rent check he had signed, every lease negotiation he had bullied his way through had gone directly to me. I wasn't just his victim, I was his landlord. The judge looked up from the list. He looked at Gavin, who was sweating profusely, and then he turned his gaze to me. The look in Judge Sterling's eyes had changed completely. The pity was gone, the skepticism was gone. In their place was a sharp, intense curiosity and a dawning respect. He realized that the woman in the oversized sweater was not a helpless invalid. She was a titan, hiding in plain sight. "Continue," Judge Sterling said to the bailiff, his voice dropping an octave, serious and grave. Gavin gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He looked like he wanted to run, but he was frozen. He knew what was happening. He wasn't just losing the lawsuit. He was finding out that the ant he had tried to crush was actually a sleeping dragon, and he had just walked right into its mouth. The bailiff reached for the third item, and I smiled. Because the money and the building were just the warm-up. The real show was about to begin. The bailiff reached into the steel briefcase for the third and final time, but this time his hand hesitated. He looked down at the document inside, and his eyes widened slightly, the professional mask slipping for just a fraction of a second. He looked up at Judge Sterling, then over at the federal prosecutor, sitting in the back row, who gave a single solemn nod. The bailiff pulled the file out. It was not a single sheet of paper like the others. It was a thick dossier bound in red tape with the words, "Top Secret," stamped across the front, in bold black letters. Item number 3. The bailiff announced, his voice losing its boom and taking on a tremor of genuine unease. This file contains a federal indictment and supporting forensic evidence regarding the estate of the late Theodore Vance. My mother shifted in her seat, her face pale. She looked at Gavin, whispering frantically, "What is happening, Gavin? What is in that file?" Gavin did not answer. He was staring at the red tape, his eyes locked on the Department of Justice seal, terrified like an animal sensing a trap snapping shut. The bailiff cleared his throat and began to read. The following evidence has been authenticated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Cybercrimes Division and the Forensic Toxicology Unit, Exhibit A. Digital correspondence and wire transfers, confirming a conspiracy to commit wire fraud and money laundering in the first degree, utilizing the accounts of Gavin Miller and Calvin Vance. My father let out a strangled sound, sinking lower in his chair, trying to make himself invisible. But the bailiff was not done. He turned the page and the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Exhibit B, Forensic Handwriting. Analysis confirming the forgery of the last will and testament of Theodore Vance, dated October 5, 2020. And finally, Exhibit C. The bailiff paused. He took a deep breath, looking directly at my parents, his expression turning from professional detachment to human disgust. Exhibit C audio. Recordings and toxicology reports confirming a conspiracy to administer lethal doses of digoxin to Theodore Vance, resulting in cardiac arrest and subsequent death. The charge is conspiracy to commit premeditated murder. The word murder hung in the air like a guillotine blade. For 3 seconds there was absolute silence, a silence so deep I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights and the ragged breathing of my mother. But then, the reality of what had just been said hit Judge Sterling like a physical blow. The judge had been leaning back in his chair, listening intently, but the moment the words "conspiracy to commit murder" left the bailiff's lips, he stood up so fast his heavy leather chair slammed into the wall behind him. His face, which had been stern, was now drained of all color, his eyes wide with shock and horror. He looked at the red stamp on the dossier. He looked at the FBI agents standing up in the back of the room, and he looked at the people sitting at the plaintiff table, people he had assumed were just greedy relatives, but who were now revealed to be monsters. "Stop! Immediately!" Judge Sterling shouted, his voice cracking with the force of his command. He slammed his hand down on the bench, pointing a shaking finger at the exit. "Bailiff, lock the doors. Get security in here right now. Nobody leaves this courtroom. This is no longer a civil hearing. This is a federal crime scene." Chaos erupted instantly. The reporters in the back row jumped to their feet, flashing cameras and shouting questions, creating a wall of noise. My mother let out a high-pitched scream, clutching her chest, looking around wildly as if searching for an exit that did not exist. Gavin tried to stand up, his chair clattering to the floor, his eyes darting toward the side door where he had entered so confidently just an hour ago. "Sit down, Mr. Miller," the judge roared, grabbing his gavel and banging it so hard the handle splintered. "You will sit down and you will keep your hands where I can see them. Clerk, call the U.S. Marshals." I sat perfectly still amidst the pandemonium, watching the dominoes fall exactly as I had arranged them. I looked at my father, who was shaking his head, muttering, "No, no, no," over and over again. I looked at my mother, who was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated terror, finally realizing that the daughter she had called a burden was actually the one holding the scale of justice. And then I looked at Gavin. The arrogance was gone. The smugness was gone. All that was left was the hollow look of a man who realized he hadn't just lost a building, he had lost his life. Judge Sterling looked down at me from the bench, his hands still shaking slightly. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice cutting through the noise, quiet and deadly serious. "Are you telling me that these people, your family murdered, your grandmother?" I stood up slowly, buttoning my oversized sweater, my eyes dry and cold. "Yes, Your Honor," I said clearly, "and I have 500 hours of audio recordings to prove it." The transition from a civil courtroom to a federal arrest site was violent and instantaneous. U.S. Marshals did not ask nicely, nor did they wait for explanations. They streamed through the side doors in tactical gear, moving with a precision that terrified the civilians in the gallery. Gavin tried to run, scrambling over the railing like a desperate rat seeking a sewer. But he didn't make it 3 feet before a marshal tackled him, the force of the impact knocking the wind out of him with a sickening thud. I watched as they wrenched his arms behind his back, the click of the handcuffs echoing louder than any gavel. My father, Calvin, did not run. He simply collapsed onto the table, burying his face in his hands, weeping openly. The dignity he had tried to project all morning evaporated, leaving only a small, terrified old man. A marshal hauled him up by the collar of his expensive jacket, reciting his rights in a monotone voice that cut through my father's sobs. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you." But my mother, Joyce, was the loudest thing in the room. She was not being handcuffed yet, but she was screaming shrill and piercing, standing alone in the center of the chaos. She looked around wildly, seeing her husband broken and her golden son-in-law pinned to the floor, and her mind snapped, unable to process the sudden shift in reality. She locked eyes with me, and her face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "Nia," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Fix this. Tell them to stop right now. Explain to them that this is a misunderstanding, you ungrateful child. What have you done to us?" I stood still, my hands clasped loosely in front of me, watching her unravel. She was still trying to command me, still trying to use maternal guilt as a weapon. But the chamber was empty. I slowly walked toward the railing separating the defendant area from the plaintiff table. My lawyer, Cole, tried to hold me back, but I shook my head, moving until I was just a few feet away from her. My mother rushed toward the railing, gripping the wood until her knuckles turned white. "Tell them you lied, Nia," she pleaded, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "We can go home. We can forget all about the conservatorship. I will let you keep the apartment. Just tell the judge you forged those papers. Tell them you are having an episode. Please do not let them take me." I looked at her. This woman who had forced me to wear rags. This woman who had regretted my birth just 10 minutes ago. I looked at the tears streaming down her face and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger, just the cold satisfaction of a job finished. "You wanted guardianship." "Mom," I said, my voice low and steady, carrying clearly over the noise of the courtroom. "You stood up there and begged the court to put someone in charge of your life, because you could not handle the burden anymore." I leaned in closer so she could see the truth in my eyes. "Well, congratulations. You got exactly what you wanted. You are now going to be under the full guardianship of the state inside a federal penitentiary. They will decide when you eat, when you sleep, and what you wear. You will never have to make a decision again. My mother gasped, recoiling as if I had slapped her. But before she could respond, Gavin started screaming from the floor, his face pressed against the carpet. It was him! It was Calvin! He yelled, struggling against the marshals. He cooked the books. He told me to forge the will. He said, the old lady was going to cut us out. I was just following orders. I want a deal. I want to talk to the prosecutor. My father lifted his head, his eyes bulging with betrayal. You lying snake! My father roared, struggling against the officer holding him. You blackmailed me. You said you would expose the gambling debts if I did not sign the transfer papers. You killed her, Gavin. You mixed the medicine. I saw you do it. The courtroom erupted again as the family turned on each other, tearing at each other's throats like starving dogs. The press photographers were having a field day, flashes popping rapidly, capturing every moment of the betrayal. Gavin was sobbing now, begging for a plea deal, blaming my father for the embezzlement, blaming my mother for the idea of the conservatorship. My mother was screaming at Gavin, calling him a traitor while my father wept and cursed them both. It was a grotesque display of their true nature, stripped of their money and their pretenses. They were not a family. They were a nest of vipers, biting each other to survive. I stood there in my oversized sweater, the only calm point in the storm, watching them destroy each other with the evidence I had given them. They had wanted to prove I was incompetent. Instead, they had proven that they were incapable of loyalty, honor, or love. The marshals began to drag them out one by one, and as Gavin was hauled past me, kicking and screaming, he looked me in the eye. You planned this? He spat. You planned this whole thing. I didn't say a word. I just smiled and tapped the pen in my pocket, letting him know that even his final outburst was recorded and ready for the sentencing hearing. As the marshals escorted my screaming family out of the courtroom, leaving a silence that felt heavy and electric, Special Agent Cole walked over to the defense table. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a badge. Not a visitor pass, but a gold shield encased in leather. He clipped it onto his belt and turned to face the judge, who was still looking at me with a mixture of shock and awe. Your Honor, Cole said, his voice calm and authoritative. For the record, I am not a public defender. I am Special Agent David Cole with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division. The woman standing next to me is not just Nia Vance. She is a senior forensic auditor and a confidential asset who has been instrumental in a 2-year undercover operation targeting a massive money laundering ring operating out of Atlanta. The judge took off his glasses and rubbed his temples, looking from Cole to me. 2 years, he repeated. You mean to tell me that this entire time, while your family was trying to declare you incompetent, you were building a federal case against them? I stepped forward, smoothing the front of my ruined sweater. Not just against them, Your Honor, I said. My voice was no longer the quiet whisper of a victim. It was the voice I used in boardrooms and interrogation cells. Gavin Miller was using his real estate firm to wash money for an international cartel. My father was the unexpected variable. He borrowed money he could not pay back, and Gavin used that leverage to force him into the scheme. When my grandmother discovered the irregularities in the accounts, they panicked. They forged her will, and when she threatened to expose them, they silenced her. I paused, letting the weight of the truth settle. I did not come back home because I was broke or homeless. I came back because we needed the physical ledger Gavin kept in his safe. The conservatorship lawsuit was the bait. We knew Gavin's ego would not let him pass up the chance to humiliate me publicly. We needed him to state under oath that he had control over the assets so we could link him directly to the illegal funds. In the back of the courtroom, my sister Brenda was sitting alone, huddled on a bench, sobbing into her hands. She had not been arrested yet, but she was watching her world crumble. When she heard me speak, When she heard the authority in my voice, she looked up. Her eyes were red and swollen. But for the first time, she really saw me. She looked at the agent standing next to me, then at the badge on my belt that I had finally pulled from my pocket. "You knew," Brenda whispered, her voice trembling. "You knew everything. All those times I made fun of your car. All those times I bragged about my trips to Europe. You were laughing at me." I walked over to the railing, looking down at my sister. The golden child. The one who had everything handed to her while I worked in the shadows. "I was not laughing, Brenda," I said. "Brenda." Quietly, I was taking notes. "Every time you flashed that credit card, you were adding another line to the indictment. You thought I was jealous of your lifestyle, but I knew exactly who was paying for it, and I knew the price tag was going to be prison time." Brenda looked at me with horror, realizing the magnitude of her own ignorance. She had spent her entire life believing she was the superior sibling, believing that money defined worth. Now she realized that while she was playing dress-up, I was owning the board. She realized that the sister she called a failure was actually a millionaire federal agent who had just dismantled their entire empire without breaking a sweat. "How much?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "How much do you really have?" I looked at her, cold and unblinking. "Enough to buy this courtroom and everyone in it," I said. "But unlike you, Brenda, I do not need to show it to know who I am." I turned back to the judge, ready to finalize the paperwork that would unseal the evidence and seal their fate. I did not feel triumph. I felt a deep, exhausting relief. The charade was over. The mask could finally come off. And as I walked out of that courtroom, leaving my sister weeping in the ruins of her vanity, I knew that the hardest part of the job wasn't catching the bad guys. It was accepting that sometimes the bad guys are the ones who raised you. 3 days after the chaos in the courtroom, I walked into the federal detention center on the outskirts of Atlanta. The air inside smelled of industrial bleach and misery, a sharp contrast to the lavender and old money scent of my parents' estate. I was wearing a tailored suit and heels, my badge clipped to my belt, visible for the world to see. The guard at the front desk nodded respectfully, buzzing me through the heavy steel doors that separated the free from the condemned. I was not there to interrogate a suspect or to gather more evidence. The case was closed. The evidence was irrefutable. I was there for one final transaction to close the ledger on my childhood once and for all. I entered the visitation room, a sterile box divided by thick plexiglass. My parents were already seated on the other side, handcuffed to the table, wearing matching bright orange jumpsuits. Seeing them stripped of their expensive clothes, their jewelry, and their dignity was jarring. My mother Joyce looked 10 years older without her makeup, her hair pulling back into a messy bun. My father. Calvin slumped in his chair, looking small and defeated, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for a waiter to bring him a drink. When I sat down, my mother pressed her hand against the glass, her fingers trembling. "Nia? Oh, thank God you came." She spoke into the small metal grate, her voice cracking with desperation. "You have to get us out of here. This place is terrible. The food is inedible and the bed is just a slab of concrete. You have to post bail." The lawyer said, "The bond is set at $1 million each. You have that kind of money now. You can pay it and we can go home. We can talk about this. We can fix this." I stared at her unmoved. She was not sorry for what she did. She was sorry she was caught. She was sorry the bed was hard. She still viewed my money as the family bank account, a resource to be tapped whenever they were in trouble. Dad leaned forward, the chains rattling against the metal table. "Nia, listen to your mother. Gavin tricked us. He told us it was the only way. You know, we would never hurt you. We were desperate. You are our daughter. You owe us this much. We raised you. We put a roof over your head." I let out a short, dry laugh. "You did not raise me," I said, my voice calm and echoing slightly in the small room. "You tolerated me. You kept me around as a spare part in case Brenda failed. And the roof you put over my head, you tried to sell it out from under me 3 days ago. You tried to drug me and lock me in a psych ward so you could rob me blind. Do not talk to me about debt, Dad. The only thing I owed you was the truth, and I delivered that in court. My mother began to weep soft, pathetic sobs intended to soften my heart. Nia, please. We are your parents. We are old. We cannot survive in prison. You cannot leave us in here with these criminals. I looked at the woman who had told a judge she regretted my birth. The woman who had treated me like a servant in my own home. You are not parents, I said quietly. You are co-conspirators, and you are exactly where you belong. I reached into my purse and pulled out a white envelope. It was thin and crisp. My father's eyes lit up with a flicker of hope. He thought it was a check. He thought it was the bail money. He thought he had won me over one last time. What is that? He asked, leaning closer. I slid the envelope through the narrow slot at the bottom of the glass partition. My father snatched it up with shaking hands, tearing it open eagerly, but when he tipped it over, no check fell out. Instead, 5 crisp $100 bills fluttered onto the table in front of him. He looked up at me confused, betrayal dawning in his eyes. What is this $500? This will not cover bail. This will not even cover the lawyer. I stood up, smoothing my jacket, looking down at them with a sense of finality. That is for your commissary account, I said, echoing the tone he had used at the birthday party when he threw the conservatorship papers at me. You can use it to buy toothpaste and snacks. It should last you a while if you are careful. My mother gasped, realizing the insult, realizing that I had just returned their cruelty with interest. Nia, you cannot be serious, she shrieked, her face twisting into ugliness. You cannot leave us here. I am not leaving you here. Mom, I said, turning toward the door. I am leaving you in the past. Do not call me. Do not write to me. My lawyer will handle the sale of your estate to pay for your restitution. Enjoy the snacks. I walked out of the room as my mother began to scream, banging her fists against the glass, shouting that I was ungrateful, that I was cruel. Her voice followed me until the heavy steel door slammed shut, cutting off the sound completely. I walked out into the bright afternoon sun and took a deep breath. The air tasted sweet. The humidity felt like a warm embrace, not a suffocating blanket. I walked to my car, my real car, not the beat-up Honda, and got in. I did not look back at the gray concrete building. I did not feel sad. I did not feel guilty. For the first time in 32 years, I felt light. The anchor was gone. And as I turned the key in the ignition, I realized that the price of my freedom was cheap. It only cost me $500 and a family I never really had. Returning to my apartment on 5th Street felt strange. Not because it had changed, but because I had the small one-bedroom unit that had been my sanctuary, my disguise and my bunker for 5 years, no longer fit the woman I had revealed to the world. Mr. Henderson, the landlord cried, when I told him I was moving out. He thought I was being evicted again, but the tears turned to shock when I handed him the deed to the building. I had bought the property from the holding company that morning and transferred ownership to him. A final act of gratitude for the only man who had tried to defend me when Gavin came knocking. It felt good to use my money to build someone up instead of tearing someone down. But I did not move into the penthouse at the top of the commercial tower I now owned. That glass box was a symbol of Gavin's vanity, not my comfort. Instead, I made a purchase that would have made my mother scream in horror. I bought back my grandmother Theodore's old house on the south side of the city. My parents had sold it years ago to cover a gambling debt, letting the beautiful Victorian structure fall into disrepair, simply because it wasn't in a prestigious enough zip code. Walking through the front door was like stepping back in time. The floorboards creaked and the wallpaper was peeling. But underneath the smell of neglect, I could still smell the faint scent of lavender and old paper that I associated with love. I hired a team of contractors the next day, not to modernize it, but to restore it. I wanted to sand down the floors. My grandmother walked on and paint the walls. the soft yellow she loved. I was not just buying a house. I was reclaiming my history, scrubbing away the stain of my parents' greed, to find the legacy underneath. The final chapter of the legal battle closed 3 months later on a crisp autumn morning. Gavin stood before Judge Sterling, looking gaunt and hollow, his expensive suit replaced by a prison uniform that hung loosely on his frame. He pleaded guilty to money laundering, wire fraud and conspiracy, avoiding a life sentence but not escaping justice. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in a federal penitentiary, with no possibility of parole for the first 10. As the gavel came down, Gavin didn't look at me, he just stared at the floor. A broken man who had flown too close to the sun on wings made of stolen cash. My parents were spared prison time largely due to their age and their testimony against Gavin, but the court showed no mercy regarding their assets. To pay the restitution for the funds they helped embezzle, the estate was seized. The Mercedes, the Range Rover, the jewelry and the furniture were all auctioned off to the highest bidder. They were left with nothing but their freedom and each other, which was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. They moved into a small, subsidized apartment downtown, a place far smaller than the one they had mocked me for living in. I heard through the grapevine that my mother tells the neighbors she is a victim of a government conspiracy, refusing to admit that the architect of her downfall was her own daughter. On the day the renovations on Grandma's house were finished, I took a drive through the city center. I was not driving the rattling Honda Civic with the squeaky brakes anymore. I was behind the wheel of a midnight blue Porsche 911 Turbo S, the engine purring with a quiet, lethal power. I pulled up to the stoplight at the corner of 5th and Wall, right in front of the high-rise building that had started it all. I looked up through the sunroof. The massive sign that used to scream Miller Enterprises was gone. A crane was lowering the last letter onto a flatbed truck, leaving the facade clean and bare. Workmen were already putting up the new branding for the Black Wall Group, my company. I watched the M swinging in the wind, a rusted relic of a false empire. People on the sidewalk stopped to look at my car, admiring the sleek lines and the obvious display of wealth. A woman in a business suit nudged her friend, pointing at the vehicle, probably wondering who was behind the tinted glass. They saw the car and assumed they knew the story. They assumed I was just another rich heiress showing off. They were wrong. I tapped the steering wheel, feeling the vibration of the engine. My family had made the fatal mistake of confusing net worth with self-worth. They thought, that because I drove a cheap car and wore simple clothes, I was weak. They thought that because I didn't brag, I had nothing to say. They forgot that the loudest person in the room is usually the most insecure. The light turned green and I eased the car forward, leaving the shadow of Gavin's building behind me for good. I didn't rev the engine, I didn't speed, I just glided forward smoothly and silently, disappearing into the flow of traffic. They judged me by the fabric of my sweater and the mileage on my odometer. They never bothered to look at the woman behind the wheel. And that is the secret they never understood. Real wealth does not need to scream for attention. It does not need to bully or brag or belittle. Silence is the true sound of power. And as I drove home to the house that love built, I had never felt more powerful in my life. My family mistook my silence for weakness and my frugality for failure. But they learned the hard way that true power never needs to announce itself. The most painful lesson I learned was accepting that sharing DNA does not guarantee loyalty. We often cling to toxic relationships out of obligation. But real freedom begins the moment you stop seeking validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Your worth is not defined by the car you drive, but by the quiet confidence of knowing exactly who you are. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living a life they can no longer touch. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to save your own future? Tell me your story in the comments below and hit subscribe if you are ready to take back your power.